Something was off from the beginning. Not a malfunction, not a warning light, not even a scream. Just a subtle absence, an altitude that failed to rise, a wing that didn't flex, a silence in the radio frequency that felt more like a premonition than a delay. Within 30 seconds of liftoff, the Air India 171 Dreamliner, once the very emblem of technological advancement and aviation safety, was nothing more than a fireball swallowing lives, metal, and memories over the heart of Ahmedabad. But in the days that followed, as investigators combed through wreckage and black boxes, what they found wasn't just mechanical failure. It was a mirror held up to a system too confident, too blind, and too slow to react. Now, new information from recovered flight data confirms the one thing nobody wanted to believe: that this crash didn't have to happen. And what's worse, it could happen again. This is the story of Flight AI171 and the dark discovery that shook Boeing, devastated families, and sent a chilling message through the global aviation industry. At 1:38 p.m., the AI-171 took off from runway 28 at Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel International Airport. It was supposed to be a transcontinental flight from Ahmedabad to London. The weather was calm, visibility was good, and the Dreamliner, a 12-year-old Boeing 787, had passed all required inspections. But the illusion of normalcy was shattered almost instantly. Witnesses saw the aircraft struggle to gain altitude. Its wings, which should have flexed gently upward under the lift of takeoff, remained eerily rigid. Seconds later, the crew radioed a desperate mayday call, barely audible and shockingly brief. Then, the plane inverted and plunged into a medical college hostel in the Mini Nagar district. The explosion that followed left 274 people dead, including students on the ground. Emergency crews, volunteers, and local police worked around the clock pulling bodies from both the wreckage and the collapsed building. DNA testing labs ran non-stop to identify victims, while families waited outside hospitals and morgues for answers that would never be enough. The scale of death was incomprehensible. But what was even more terrifying was how fast it had all happened, from takeoff to impact in under 45 seconds. Among the scorched metal and twisted seats, one man was pulled out alive. Vishwas Kumar Romesh, a 23-year-old seated in 11A, became the sole survivor of India's deadliest aviation disaster in a generation. His testimony sent shivers down the spine of every investigator and pilot reading the transcript. Romesh recalled that the left side of the cabin collapsed around him almost immediately. The emergency door ripped open and the cabin depressurized, sucking debris and passengers into a storm of fire and steel. He saw a blinding flash and then remembered crawling out, through fire, through blood, through noise he said was louder than death. His survival wasn't a miracle, it was an anomaly. Investigators began to wonder, how could an aircraft so modern, so praised, collapse so catastrophically so quickly? His escape raised more questions than answers, and those answers would soon emerge from the black boxes, answers that suggested this wasn't an accident at all. With the cockpit voice recorder and flight data unit recovered from the wreckage, engineers began decoding what had really gone wrong, and what they found was both simple and horrifying. In the early moments of flight, the co-pilot appeared to have retracted the aircraft's flaps, confusing them with the landing gear switch. Flaps are essential for creating the lift needed during takeoff. Without them, the Dreamliner became a brick with wings. But how could such an error happen? Captain Steve, a former commercial pilot turned aviation analyst, laid it bare in a viral breakdown. It was cockpit design. The Dreamliner's interface, praised for its sleekness, had been called out in past simulations for its counterintuitive layout. Combined with high workload, pressure, and perhaps fatigue, a momentary switch flip doomed the entire aircraft. No storm, no bird strike, no fuel leak, just a misstep and a design flaw. That detail, confirmed by the recovered data logs, proved what safety advocates feared for years. The technology meant to make flying safer had become too automated, too detached from human logic. And in that automation, humanity lost control. The fallout was immediate. Boeing's stock plummeted by nearly 9% overnight. The GNX engines, praised for their fuel efficiency, were now under intense scrutiny. Maintenance logs revealed the left flap actuator had been serviced just weeks before, but scene-offs were delayed due to missing parts. It was a perfect storm of oversight and error. India's aviation ministry ordered emergency inspections of all Dreamliners in the country. The Directorate General of Civil Aviation launched Operation Double Check, a full audit of maintenance logs, crew protocols, and supply chains. At the same time, international regulators from the UK and US joined the investigation under Annex 13 of the Chicago Convention. Meanwhile, public outrage surged. Hashtags like Justice for AI171 and Pray for Ahmedabad trended globally. Memorials rose in city squares. Families demanded accountability. Air India, still recovering from privatization under the Tata Group, announced compensation and a new safety overhaul. But for many, it was too late. The Dreamliner was no longer a symbol of safety. It was a warning sign. And what it warned of wasn't mechanical failure. It was human fragility masked by technological arrogance. 3 weeks after the crash, an anonymous email arrived at the inbox of the Indian Directorate General of Civil Aviation. It was unsigned, encrypted, and marked as Priority Read. Inside was a whistleblower memo from a former Boeing systems engineer, detailing a hidden flaw in the Dreamliner's cockpit software. The memo described a bug in the flap position detection algorithm, an error that, under specific power cycling conditions, could cause false readings to appear on the primary flight display. Worse still, the memo claimed that internal teams at Boeing were aware of this intermittent issue, but deemed it non-critical due to its rare occurrence. That single message sparked a global firestorm. Investigators rushed to cross-reference the black box data, and sure enough, 15 seconds before flap retraction, the co-pilot's screen had momentarily shown the flaps as fully deployed. The pilot acted based on what he saw, not what was real. The revelation changed the narrative. This wasn't just human error, it was software betrayal. And it had gone unnoticed, or unreported, for years. In an underground facility outside Seattle, aviation investigators recreated the final 45 seconds of Flight AI171 using a full-scale Dreamliner simulator. The crew, composed of ex-Air India pilots, was briefed on the same weather, weight, fuel load, and flap configuration recorded during the crash. Multiple scenarios were tested. In each one, as the simulated aircraft took off with flaps unexpectedly retracted and the erroneous display active, the plane failed to climb and ultimately crashed. Every single time. The simulator confirmed the deadliest part of the crash wasn't the moment of impact. It was the moment of decision. That split second when the co-pilot relied on the screen. The tests were leaked to the press, who dubbed them the ghost flights of AI171. The footage was chilling, screens flashing, warning lights silent, pilots frozen in confusion. It wasn't a human failure in isolation, it was a design flaw masquerading as modernity, and that terrified every commercial pilot watching. Families of the victims, once silenced by grief, now turned to outrage. Lawsuits erupted across jurisdictions, against Air India, against Boeing, even against software contractors in Bangalore linked to the display interface. The U.S. Federal Aviation Administration launched a joint investigation with Indian regulators, demanding access to internal Boeing emails and test logs dating back 6 years. The CEO of Boeing was summoned before a congressional subcommittee, where he was grilled about prior reports of software glitches in other models. Meanwhile, several international airlines announced grounding pauses for Dreamliners pending further inspection. Insurance companies began rewriting policies on cockpit liability, and unions demanded revisions to pilot training protocols, including mandatory cross-checks for visual flap indicators. The aviation world was in upheaval, but for the families holding photos, ashes, and broken dreams, legal settlements meant nothing. They wanted accountability, they wanted truth, and they weren't backing down. As the dust settled, something unexpected began to happen. Commercial pilots from all over the world started reporting a phenomenon experts called Dreamliner anxiety. It wasn't fear of flying, it was fear of their own systems. Confidence in automation had cracked. Flight schools updated their training to emphasize manual verification over digital trust. Aviation psychologists were called in to treat survivors of past near-miss events involving similar cockpit displays. Mental health hotlines for flight crews surged in activity. Retired pilot associations issued open letters calling for a global summit on cockpit design ethics. The very culture of aviation, a culture that prided itself on precision, confidence, and mastery, was now confronting its deepest insecurity. For the first time, pilots weren't afraid of the weather, or of terrorism, or of structural failure. They were afraid of their own planes. And the ghost of AI171 hovered silently in every cockpit where a switch was flipped, a screen flickered, and a life depended on whether the truth was real or merely displayed. In a world that worships technology, we often forget a dangerous truth. Machines don't make decisions. People do, based on the information those machines give them. And when that information is flawed, when a screen betrays the hands that guide it through the skies, the result isn't just a malfunction, it's a massacre disguised in silence. The story of Air India 171 is no longer just a tragedy locked in the past. It's a mirror reflecting the future of aviation and the risks we're still willing to take. It warns us that no amount of innovation can replace integrity, that no algorithm should go unchecked, and that behind every blinking cursor in a cockpit is a beating human heart that deserves the full truth. What happened in those final moments wasn't just a failure of a screen or a button, it was the collapse of trust. And until that trust is rebuilt, every takeoff carries with it a quiet, invisible question. What if the next flight is already showing the wrong numbers? So now the world watches. Pilots hesitate, engineers scramble, families mourn, and somewhere deep in a corporate archive lies the original report no one wanted us to see. Because sometimes it's not the crash that scares us, it's the cover-up. If you made it to the end of this video, it's because you know this story matters. Help us make the world listen. Share this video, leave a comment, and most importantly, subscribe so we can keep exposing the truths they'd rather keep hidden.